gravestone at my funeral, I want somebody to talk about how I yelled for years that Jazz fans are just not racist. But that's becoming harder and harder. I truly don't believe that the majority of Jazz fans are. I've lived here 20 years, and I've come across more good people than I can really tell you in this space. But then the Jazz released their Instagram statement, and Jazz fans take to the Instagram page and inundate it with things that just make me sad. Your buddy Amin El-Hassan, we're going to try and get him on next week, came out with a really, I thought, on-point video on Instagram and then released it on Twitter as well. And I don't know that I have a question outside of, I think I know what the reputation of Jazz fans are, and things like today don't help, but do you think there's a problem here that needs to be addressed? Because the conversation, Tom, has turned into, because Donovan's commenting on all these Instagram posts, and now people are saying, like, is this dude going to leave because the fans are this way? It's been a rough morning for Jazz fans for sure.
Look, I think you said it last week, and I think, I know Quin Snyder, the coach, said it on Adrian Wojnarowski's podcast at ESPN. It's time to listen. So I don't like the rhetoric that I see from my fellow white Americans who are claiming in very loud terms, I'm not racist. We are not racist. Seems like that is not what we want to do here, is to dispel any or absolve ourselves of any racist, whether they're subtle or whether they're blatant, racist behavior. And I think this is the time to listen to the various NBA players who have played in Utah, the various NBA players who have come through Utah and experienced, some epithets thrown at them in the, verbally, or any sort of behavior that they deem to be racially motivated or racially charged. Like, this is the time to not beat your chest, excuse the phone ringing in the back, to beat your chest about being innocent in all this. And I think Quin Snyder is right, is that this should be a time of listening rather than beating our chest as defending ourselves before we listen to the real stories that have been kept under wraps for so long.
All that's definitely well put. And, like I said, I'll continue to stand up for my city, and I'll continue to stand up for Jazz fans, but loyalty to the wrong people makes you look like the fool. And I'm fully aware of that. So I guess we'll transition to this. What have you made since we last spoke? What have you made of the news cycle, the way, players in the league have reacted and people around the country? We have a lot of former players on and trying to give a voice to maybe the voiceless and a platform for people to kind of tell us how they're feeling. And I have spoke to several people over the past week or so that feel like the reaction has been something that causes some hope that this might be able to last. I'm not sure. Where are you at with it?
Yeah, so I had Lloyd Pierce, the coach of the Atlanta Hawks, on my podcast this week. You can listen to the conversation with him. It was really, really insightful on the Haberstroh podcast, wherever you listen to podcasts. And Lloyd Pierce is 44 years old. He's one of the youngest coaches in the league. He's only a second-year head coach. He also happens to be African-American. And he has been at the forefront of the activism amongst coaches. And one of the things that he's talking about is that coaches aren't going to solve this. This has to be a partnership with all levels of society. It's not going to be basketball players. It's not going to be basketball coaches. It's not going to be black basketball players. It's not going to be white basketball players. It's going to be a partnership with everybody. And I think that's one of the things that we have to understand is when you say all lives matter, it is a way to demean the movement of Black Lives Matter. And what Lloyd Pierce was suggesting is that white privilege is all about trying to hold on to your privilege, hold on to your status, your social status, and not letting others, quote unquote, encroach on that territory. And he says that's not the way to think about it. it's not a zero-sum game. I think if you look at the ideals of this country, equality is everywhere, right? And achieving that equality may mean that by lifting up black voices, some people need to shut up. Some people who have had the floor for so long need to sit back and listen. And, I think that's a big thing here is when you see the systematic level of institutional racism around the country, where the highest levels of power are given to white Americans, you start to see what Lloyd Pierce is talking about. For example, in the NBA, it's 75% African-American players. You go up to the coaching level, and it's 27% African-American. You go to the GM level, it's even lower than that. And at the ownership level, it's only one African-American owner in the NBA and actually one African-American owner in all the four major sports in America, and that's Michael Jordan. And so that's what I think he's getting at is the institutional barriers, whether it's socioeconomic, whether it's healthcare, whether it's jobs. This is something that isn't going to be corrected overnight. This is something that's lasted 400 years in the making here in America. And what Lloyd Pierce is saying is that this isn't going to be overnight. And when you ask me the longer lasting, is this going to be sustainable and longer lasting? Know that this isn't going to be over and done with shut case in a year or in a month or maybe 10 years. This is going to be a movement that I think will have lasting sustainability if it's going to work. It's not going to be something that is going to be a law that passes overnight and suddenly everything's better. I just think it's really hard to change people's attitudes, really hard to change money, and it's really hard to change people who feel entrenched in their own worldview because it has benefited them. I think Greg Popovich said it best, is white people often feel like they were born, or they were often white people think they were born at home plate when they're actually born at third base. And I think that's important to think about is a lot of white privilege, the things that we were given as children, may not be afforded to people that are of a different color. And I think that's something we really have to think about and try to have long-lasting change.
That's well put. And last thing on this, then we'll move on to some other stuff, even though it just feels weird to talk about anything else right now. But there's some news with the NBA. And you brought up some really good points, and the fact that it was the societal and institutionalized racism and hatred and downright injuring and marginalization of African Americans was intentionally created hundreds of years ago, so people that look like you and I can create wealth. I mean, essentially, that's what it comes down to, with a lot of other nuanced pieces in there certainly we could get to. But when you look at it from that prism and you realize that the cards have not only been stacked against the African-American community, but anytime they start to break the house of cards down, we build it back up again and then call it by a different name. I keep telling my listeners, go watch The 13th on Netflix. You will just be blown away. What have you learned, Tom, over the past couple of weeks, and what do you hope to continue to learn so people like you and I, who look like the problem but hopefully are not, can just continue to get better and make progress, and hopefully other people can learn along the way?
I've learned to be open to perspectives that I did not hold when I was a teenager or hold when I was 25. Now that I'm 34, I think it's important, like we've said on this show, is to don't be afraid when presented with new information to have a different perspective. And I think for people, it's really hard to listen to people that they are not familiar with. But I would encourage everyone listening at home to listen to the most recent episode of the BOMB podcast, BOMM, Black Opinions Matter Monday. It's with a lot of NBA folks that you recognize. Amin El-Hassan's on the show. Wozni Lambre, who is on at The Athletic, and Trevon Edwards at The Athletic are on that podcast. And I think it's important to listen and to learn. And part of that has to do with actually doing the work and listening. So what have I learned? I've learned to listen to perspectives that I did not share when I was 5 years old or 10 years old or 15. And for me, I was in a white suburban town of Westport, Connecticut. And those opportunities to listen to other people were not readily available with the internet. Now you can. So go download the Bomb podcast and start learning, start listening. And I think that's a good first step.
Okay, moving on to the news since we last spoke that the NBA is coming back. At least that's what the plan is. And you've been probably better than this than anybody that we've spoken to, or quite frankly, anyone that I've listened to anywhere, with the cautious optimism but honest breakdown and honest assessment of really where the league is at. So, when we had you on after the announcement of July 31st, you were very articulate about why they were waiting so long to start, because of all of the paths that they have to traverse. And, it was only a couple of days before another story broke about a complication that came up that was kind of unforeseen. So before we get to some micro, let's just go with the macro first. Your take on the recent news cycle, and where's the Tom Haberstroh confidence meter that the league is actually going to not just come back, but complete the season and crown a champ?
Ooh, man, there's so much here. I think I've been more pessimistic than my peers. I think Zach Harper said it was 100% recently, and I just don't share that. I would say it's probably 60% that we're going to have a full season and crown a champion, simply because the NBA is going to have to give a little bit here when it comes to the 6-week quarantine that is being mandated to the Players Association right now. As it stands now, it's being reported that NBA players, if they go into this bubble, will be required to not have family or guests for 6 weeks minimum. 6 weeks without family. I can't, outside of being in college, can't imagine that. And so for a lot of these NBA players, I think they agreed to larger, big tentpole issues rather than understanding, oh, by the way, we're going to go 22 teams, and it's going to be July 30th to October 12th. And we're going to be at Disney World. You're going to be free to go play golf, free to go to restaurants, and it'll be cool. Oh, that sounds great. Okay. By the way, your wife and kids not allowed to come, and actually not allowed to come for 6 weeks. So you good with that? Wait, what? Wait, what? I think that's how the conversation went, is the players agree to the larger topics. And then once you drill down and realize what it all means, I think there's going to be some pushback. And I think it's going to get a little uglier here before it gets better on those notes.
When you saw the news, because I'm sure you probably had an idea that this was the case before it was reported by Woj. And look, Woj does a great job. That's why he gets everything. And then the story that ESPN followed up with the players that are pushing for permission to stay home, essentially. How real? I know he's reporting something that's real. That's what he does. But I mean, is there a real threat to this thing when it comes to players that do have the desire to stay home? And do you think those players are comprised of majority of heavy hitters? And if that's real, Tom, how do you think it affects the optics of the thing when it comes back?
Yeah, so I was talking to someone involved with knowledge of the players' thinking here. Yesterday I was having this conversation, and the person was telling me, imagine if the Sacramento Kings lose their first 2 games in this regular season, and they're basically eliminated from the playoffs, and their families are waiting at home, and you've been away for 5 weeks, 4 weeks, let's say. You're going to want to go back, right?
Sure.
You've been away from your family for 4 weeks. You know that you're not going to make the playoffs. You know that playing is going to increase your risk for injury. And you know that it's been 4 weeks in this bubble. It's time to go. That is what the worry is that players, I think, are looking at the situation and recognizing that, if we lose our first 2 games, I mean, do I want to still be there for 2 weeks? And so I think that's what Woj's report is getting at, is Now the realities are starting to set in. Is, okay, the 8-game regular season sounds good, but for a lot of these teams on the fringe, a 3-game losing streak or having a bad start or your star player gets injured, are you going to really want to stick around for those 2 weeks? So it doesn't seem like a lot in the grand scheme of things, especially for people like, oh, they make millions of dollars. Like, come on. Well, if we learn anything in this Black Lives Matter movement, it's that these are human beings. They're not just people on your TV or people or names on a website. So you have to keep that in mind. And I do think that, if Damian Lillard comes out and says, I'm not playing in this, I think other players might follow.
And I agree with that. And the other thing, and Tom will end on this, and we'll set you loose. The other thing that I think is probably underrated that not a lot of people are talking about is I don't think there's going to be a tremendous amount of respect for whoever wins the title this year. I think they're going to be looked at differently. Now, look, at the end of the day, will it count as a ring? Sure. So I'm sure LeBron would love to get a fourth, and I'm sure people would prefer to have a ring as opposed to not have it. But I think it's like the old thing with high school. You wanted to sit at a different lunch table. And when the popular kid says whoever wins, that's a joke, nobody's going to respect them, then the other popular kids listen. And if LeBron takes his ball and goes home, I'm afraid that it could be Kawhi and Chris Paul and Harden and all these guys, all these, heavy hitters who start to think to themselves, like, even if we win, no one's going to really respect the accomplishment anyway because it's so different. And I'm afraid that could lead to kind of like a mass exodus of guys just bouncing and going home. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Yeah, I think largely the asterisk thing is going to be dictated by who wins the championship. And I have a column coming out tomorrow talking to epidemiologists about, just the different health questions here. But one of the things that struck me is, if you want to leave the bubble, you have to be quarantined for 10 days when you come back. So if you hurt your wrist and want to get a second opinion on your wrist X-ray and you leave, you basically waste 2 weeks of games. If a cluster of coronavirus breaks out and they got to shut down a team, let's say the Lakers, what does that do for the entire playoff format? Then a team is going to proceed and go into the next series without having to win a single game. Those are the sort of things that I think we have to wait and see about the legitimacy of a championship when certain things like that shake up the system. I don't think it's enough to say, hey, if they play these 7-game series and nothing changes, whoever wins has an asterisk. I do think that things get really complicated if there's a shutdown in the finals and the Milwaukee Bucks are standing atop because a player got coronavirus on the opposing team. I think that's the tricky situation. We just have to wait and see. And this is one of those things where I think whoever wins is probably going to dictate whether there's an asterisk or not.
Good stuff. Tom, appreciate the time, as we always do this week. You make all of us smarter, our listeners, myself, so appreciate the knowledge. Be safe over the weekend and next week, and hopefully we'll have some other positive things to get to next Thursday, man. Be well, okay?
You got it. Take care.